Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to a very special bonus episode on the topic of NoEstimates, but with a very specific twist. We're going to talk about NoEstimates in the government sector, specifically in the US. And we have with us to talk about it, Craeg Strong. Hey, Craeg, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So Craeg is the CTO of Ariel Partners, a woman-owned IT consulting company based in Times Square. He's currently teaching classes in Kanban, test automation, human-centered design, and helping organizations transform themselves by connecting strategy with execution. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, handling dependencies and improving quality. He has a lot more experience than I, 25 years experience on the IT sector, starting at Project Athena during his undergraduate studies at MIT. And Craeg recently helped teach 1,200 Air Force personnel on Jira and Agile. So, Craeg, obviously you have a lot of experience, but today you're here to talk about a specific type of experience. We'll dive into what that is in all details as we go through this episode. But why don't you introduce to our listeners your story? Why are you here talking about NoEstimates in the federal government?
Yes, we're often called in to provide assistance, maybe do some assessments, why projects are not going as planned. And this has happened multiple times in different agencies, most recently in the Social Security Administration. And what's unique about the federal government is, and not unique, but what's special about them is that many, or really perhaps most of their projects are very large. So you're really not talking about your classic, perfect one Scrum team or two Scrum teams or a little Kanban team over here. You're talking about massive efforts, interconnected, a lot of legacy migration. It's way off on the into the red in terms of the complexity level. So you're just reading the Scrum guide or taking a quick course on Kanban is rarely enough. You really need to look at other things then. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that we're using public money. So this is the taxpayers' money. So there are often, for many of these projects, there are specific objectives that need to be achieved. They are ongoing programs, many of them, but there are often sort of specific targets, like we need to get off those mainframes, things like that.
And sometimes even with very tight deadlines, either regulatory or some others, like the loss of support for some old hardware.
Exactly right. So we can't it's not enough to say, well, let's just earmark $1 million a year and we'll just keep going. Which you can for certain places, that's completely fine. But often for the federal government, there's very specific targets, and we need to have some sense up front of how long and when we're going to get there and how much it's going to cost.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the key aspects of why I got started with NoEstimates in the first place, which was this recognition. I usually call it the Christmas problem, right? I worked in a company that did consumer products. And in consumer products, you have this big sales season. You have the pre-Christmas, Christmas, and then you have a little bit of the post-Christmas gift exchange market. So it's about, 3 months or 2.5 months where you make 50% sometimes of the overall yearly revenue. And if you're not ready on time, you simply miss that whole thing, right? I remember talking with a colleague of mine who was in charge of distribution, and he told me very clear, look, if you guys don't have the software ready in September, we're out of the game. And we're like, wait a minute, but it's Christmas, right? Why do we need to get ready in September? Well, because the distributors will buy the product in early October so that they can ship it and have it ready in warehouses in early November so that they can distribute it in mid-November for the pre-Christmas market so that the shelves are stacked from mid-November to end of December. If they don't have enough product, they stop buying our products.
That's right.
So deadlines are a key aspect of why I also got started with NoEstimates, which makes the next question a very interesting question, which is, okay, so you go into these massive projects with clear, tight deadlines, externally imposed deadlines in some cases, with very clear, sometimes archaic project management structures that are ossified, right? Like, because you need to do all of these things, they are ossified into the organization. How did you end up getting NoEstimates to even work there?
Yes. Well, just to review briefly, like to dive one level deeper into the problem, it's really sort of twofold, and you can't really tease them apart. We know we have an objective, we know the date, we know, or at least a date range. Sometimes it's a very specific date, but what does that mean when they say it's got to be done? What do we mean by it? Even defining what the scope really means and what they sort of mean a critical mass or some minimum viable amount that's needed to reach this objective. It does not mean every single thing we could ever dream up for this project. So defining what that is and scoping that out and seeing if it's even feasible, and then are there any paths to achieve that? That's the problem that I realized needed to be solved. And I first saw some signs of hope in the Kanban community. And when I read your NoEstimates book, that's when I knew, aha, this is the way forward. This is what we need.
So, of course, when you read the book, you got a lot of ideas. I'm sure many of them not mine, because obviously you are bringing in, when you read the book, you bring in all of your experience from the past, which is great. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's so important to read books, is that you're not really reading the book that the author wrote. You're reading the book you're ready to receive, right? Like the one that fits your current context. And that's really precious and valuable. So you read the book, you got some ideas, you mixed it together with the ideas you already had. What did you do then? Like, what were the things you started trying out to try to come up with the solution to this problem?
Well, I spoke with a bunch of people, a lot of different people. It's one great thing about the Kanban community in particular, and the Agile community, but even, as a whole, of course, but even a special shout out for the Kanban community, because there's just so much interesting work being done and breakthroughs and new ideas. And and I think part of that's because the openness of Kanban. Kanban doesn't really specify or predefine roles and processes and everything. There's just a lot of openness there. So it has naturally encouraged people to come in and try to figure these problems out. And so there's some very, very amazing stuff going on, in particular with the using statistical methods to try to approach this problem, looking at Monte Carlo simulations. There's a whole body of literature out there as to why these statistical approaches are better than, let's say, story points, and there's a place for both. But why, when you're looking at these larger forecasts and milestones, why a statistical approach is probably the better one. So there's that thought. And then there's, well, okay, practically speaking, are there tools out there? I mean, it's great to know that there's a technique, but I don't really feel like sitting down and programming it or firing up Excel. Are there some tools I can use? It turns out there are. And what's ironic is many of them are built into the tools that all of these organizations are using today. And I have yet to find an organization that's actually using these. So they're probably the easy to use this area.
Can you give an example of what is one of those tools that is, or techniques that is built into the common tools that we often see out there?
Well, for example, Jira. Jira has at least two great products, Nave and Actionable Agile, that provide a statistical approach to doing some forecasting. And version 1. So version 1 is actually very popular in the federal government, surprisingly so. I did not know that, but there's a lot of very, very large agencies that have rolled it out across the entire agency. But if you look, there actually is a module in version 1 where you can do forecasting, and it's using Monte Carlo.
So you started looking at, okay, so this is the challenge. These are some of the tools I found while I was looking for it. And then what? What happened next?
We responded to a request for proposal from the Social Security Administration. And what was really interesting about this one was that it was not from the agency proper. It was from the Office of the Inspector General.
And that's important here in the story, right? So why don't you explain to our audience who's not savvy in the American government accountability and follow-up system, like what is the officer of the Inspector General and why was that important in this story?
So most federal agencies do have an OIG, an Office of the Inspector General, and their job is to look for waste, fraud, and abuse. And they coordinate with a central body called the Government Accountability Office, and they put out what's called the Yellow Book. And the Yellow Book dictates the procedures and standards that they have to follow to conduct audits. And it's really audits that they're doing, performance audits, financial audits, all things of this nature. They also follow up on, whistleblowing, things like that. But one of the things they need to do is to see, okay, we're spending $300 million to build this software system. Is that money being spent appropriately? Are we going to reach the objectives we're supposed to reach? So that's where forecasting comes in.
Yeah, exactly. So you answer that RFQ or request for quote from the officer of the Inspector General of the Social Security Administration, which is, again, as I said, very important because it's not the people doing the project, it's the people checking if the projects are being done properly.
Exactly.
What happened next?
So they told us that the whole agency is moving to Agile. And as is really, across the whole federal government, they're a little bit late to the game, but nearly every agency now is using Agile pretty much everywhere. But a lot of them are still relatively new to Agile. So the OIG they can't review everything, right? They have a limited staff, but they tend to review the largest and most important projects. And these were using Agile, which was new to them. And so the OIG said, well, okay, so show us your schedule. How is it going? Are you on track? And they said, oh, no, we don't do that. And OIG said, well, what do you mean you don't do that? Well, we're Agile. The way you're even phrasing that question, that's old thinking. That's old school. We don't do that anymore. So the OIG was very frustrated saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we need our own Agile experts here because that just doesn't sound right. No schedules, no accountability, no budgets. How can that be right? So thus we were hired.
And you were hired, of course. I'm thinking here, maybe that's not the case, but I'm thinking that the people who hired you initially had that perspective of, the work they used to do at OIG, right? Like we want to see schedules, we want to see plans, and we want to see milestone plans, and we want to see the completion tracking and all of that. And you come in, and of course, because you're there to help them understand what Agile means in practice, there's going to be some challenges there. So what were some of the challenges that happened? And of course, I'm also interested, how did you even put NoEstimates into the picture? Because that's what we hear in the NoEstimates community all the time. This would never work in government because...
Well, I have to hand it to the SAOIG. I mean, they kind of knew what they needed or suspected. And so in the very beginning, they said, well, we need your consulting assistance, but we also need your training. And so the first thing we did was a whole battery of trainings, starting with really the whole thing, human-centered design, how that is completely different in Agile, Scrum and Kanban. And I actually split those out on purpose because I taught a separate class for team level Scrum and then a separate class for scaled Scrum, where I talked about less, safe, Nexus, all that stuff. And then I taught a class on team level Kanban and then on scaling Kanban. So I separated those out because there's a lot of confusion on what scales, what doesn't. So I wanted to be very, very clear. They were learning for the first time and they really needed this knowledge. So I wanted to be very clear about that. We had a separate course also on estimation, forecasting, and metrics. So they got a full battery of trainings, and I have never had a better class. I mean, these auditors are sharp, and they got into it right away. So it was really fun. We did the simulations and the Kanban game and the Okaloa and all that good stuff. Lego for Scrum, but they really got it. And so by the time we started our consulting, they already kind of knew and suspected. Okay, they knew what they needed to do, and so it's been a really interesting experience working with them.
And of course, at this point, conversation flows to the question we always get, okay, but how did you convince them that no estimates would even be a thing? Like, how did you help these people figure out how no estimates could help them do their job?
So I did explain story points in the training where I talked about estimation. I introduced several methods of estimation, and I showed, in fact, how in some tools you can flip back and forth. When I'm using Jira and I'm looking at graphs, I'll flip between story count and story point. Because when you're looking in the small, when you're just looking at a 2-week span, I find that looking at both is very interesting. And the example I used in my training was I had a certain burn down, and I said, what does this burn down mean? What can you infer from this? And we could see that one was much lower than the other. And we could say, well, one possible interpretation is that what we've done is we've cherry picked the very small user stories and got them done and left the larger user stories for later, which means the sprint scope is in jeopardy. So that kind of thing. I think there can be usefulness for teams that are already using story points. For many of these government efforts, that's just mandated. So you really can't get away from that, at least not immediately. So it's very much a water moving around the rock. You don't say stop doing story points because you'll get all kinds of emotional resistance, but you show these additional techniques and show where they're useful. And when it comes to right sizing user stories and things like that, and if you want to still do story points, no problem, And at some point, you can show that, hey, you're really getting the same results, whether you story point or not. Do you really need to continue to story point? Or if the tool needs it, fine, make everything of 3, which is basically the same thing. I think that's the approach I took. That's what I taught. And they got it right away. They immediately understood it. So it was now getting the teams to adopt that's a bigger challenge. So right now, what we've done, I should explain that the OIG does audits, and they submit those audits, and hopefully the agency changes their behavior in response to that. But it's not a direct. We can't say, stop doing that and do this. We can send our audits, and by the way, those audits go to the Senate Finance Committee. They go to the House Ways and Means Committee, and they go to the GAO. So it's a big deal. So most likely the behavior will change.
So one of the things that we were talking about before we started recording was this, some of the insights that you got. And one of the things you mentioned was an insight when you looked at all the projects that were going and what you found about how they were being managed. Can you share that with us?
Well, it's interesting. It's true at SSA, and I've seen it in several other federal agencies, that the teams are adopting Agile principles, and they're doing the best they can. They many times they're just trying to absorb team level Agile, and they haven't even been taught any scaling techniques at all, or any techniques for handling dependencies. So which is really tough. But they're doing their best, and they're adopting Agile. But what's surrounding them, there's been no change there. So oftentimes we call that water scrum fall, where in the beginning you have a traditional approach where projects are scoped, and maybe function point analysis is used. There's some scoping efforts and estimation techniques they use, and a lot of spreadsheets. And you need to do that. You need to do something, because we need to know how much taxpayer money is needed. Is this a $30 million project or a $300 million project? So they need to figure that out up front.
And they do that. They do a bit of analysis up front for that, right? And then they come up with the cost, like the estimated cost, because that's part of the process. What happens next?
So they do that. They have this estimate, but unfortunately the teams are not really able to leverage any of that work. So there's a tremendous amount of work that's done up front. I mean, not tremendous, but a certain amount of work. And then, of course, that has to continue because plans sometimes change. We don't always meet our deadlines. Horrors, newsflash. But so that's an ongoing thing. But that's just a separate effort, and it doesn't. The project team never really gets the benefit of that. They just see the downside. They say, "Oh God, there's a target we got to hit. How are we ever going to do that?" And so they really almost start off demoralized. Well, how can we possibly hit this schedule? Because so there's duplicative efforts, and it's ongoing, and there's not really a way to do feedback.
So then that presents another problem, at least as far as I can understand what you're describing, which is that, the project is approved with a certain cost and a certain deadline based on that initial analysis. But then the teams, because they're using Agile, they can't really take advantage of all of that analysis, but they still have to
Exactly.
meet that target in cost and time. Now, that's a tough challenge because the work that team is doing is not being estimated the same way the original analysis was estimated.
Exactly. So they're doing function point analysis, different things, and so it's not even they can't even it's not even apples, it's apples and oranges. So when they're creating things like epics and user stories, that's not even the same terminology. There's nothing
the
in front.
planning currency, that's kind of the term that I like to use, right? Like the planning currency, which was function points or high level descriptions or use cases in the original analysis, is not the same planning currency that the teams use because they use epics and features and stories, or just epics and stories, whatever they're using. But that creates yet another problem, which is now we're not even talking about the same things, and it's hard to even trace back what is this story about. Like, is there something in the original analysis that talks about this?
Right. So you can see how these large projects get even larger because the managers are saying, my God, I don't have enough people to make this deadline. I need to get more people. And then they have to constantly update their plans to reflect the upfront planning, the planning that the other team is the other part of the organization is doing, and somehow keep that in sync. And then usually there's a third thing, which is a roadmap. And often the roadmap is just a PowerPoint. So that's completely disconnected. So they're basically sort of maintaining multiple different artifacts. None of them are connected, so it's just more and more people to maintain more and more stuff and constantly synchronize it. So,
and of course, right into this mess comes NoEstimates and the work that you are doing. So how did that come about?
So the way I taught the class to the auditors was that when you've got a large scale agile project and you need to do estimates, what we do not do is estimate everything down to the lowest level detail up front, because that would be waterfall. So what you want to do is capture the entire scope at a very coarse grained level, but you've got to capture as close as you can get to the entire scope. So a lot of times, we'll start out with the vision document and circle the nouns. It's that sort of old school, tried and true. There's different techniques now that can be used to get a little better than that.
I can think of impact mapping, story mapping.
Yes. Yep. And all of those. So in fact, I included all those techniques in that training as well as different possible ways to do that.
So that's step one, right? Like capture the entire scope, even at the very high level.
Exactly. Just enough. So it's just enough upfront to get that high level. And then what I recommended to them is just put them in buckets. Just again, using expert knowledge. Is this XL t-shirt size? XL, L, medium, small, or baby T? Then as we go through the project, we're going to be doing just-in-time refinement. But what we need to do is take all those numbers and plug them back in. So if we find out that what we thought was a medium is actually a large, we can update that. We can also track the rate at which our upfront estimate of how many stories we might have really translate into the number of stories we really end up with. And generally, in a lot of the projects I've been in, it's usually about 100%. So if I think there's going to be about 30 user stories for this epic, there's usually around 60.
By the way, that's a very good rule of thumb, which is that whatever you think it's going to take, whether it is number of stories or time, it's going to take more. And it doesn't matter how much you buffer it, it always takes more, right? Because you discover a lot of stuff as you go. And one of the things that comes to mind, though, like, so you start with this very high course level or description of scope, and a very common question I get, well, but the items in the backlog, you don't know how big they are, so how can you track number of stories? And one of the advantages of doing that step one you described, which is capturing the scope in very large blocks, like at least in the Agile community, we would call them epics, right? Is that you can also trace the rate of delivery of epics, right? Like if you know that you deliver about 2 epics per quarter and you have 10 epics, then it's 5 quarters. I mean, of course, give or take, you never know exactly, but you can update that forecast as you start getting more information. Another trick that I've used in the past is something akin to what you just described, which is that once the epic is broken down, you start to get a feel for how many stories there are in an epic. And maybe you've broken down 3 epics and they have on average 20 stories. Then you can assume that all the other epics will have on average 20 stories. Some will have more, some will have less, and that's okay. And you can start to intuit the actual rate of progress against the backlog, right? And I call this the Disneyland Heuristic. If you know how many kilometers or miles there are from here to Disneyland, and you know your average speed, which will be around 70 miles per hour in the US, 100 kilometers per hour in Europe because of the highways, then you know it's going to take 7 hours, right? 700 miles, 700 kilometers, 100 kilometers an hour, that's 7 hours. So of course, if you stop to pee every 5 minutes, and some families, especially some parents listening to this, will definitely relate to that, then it's going to take more than 7 hours, right? Like, so I call this the Disneyland heuristic because it's all about understanding what is the problem in its high level definition, right? As you said, the high level scope in course epics, and then just count them, right?
Absolutely right. And so, unfortunately, what we found was because the teams they didn't even recognize that that was a problem to be solved. In fact, far from it, they thought that all that sort of forecasting stuff and milestones, everything, that wasn't their job. That was the job of the folks who did the upfront and maintain those estimates. So because they didn't feel it was a problem worth solving, and it wasn't even their problem, there was really very little effort spent at even making it possible. So, for example, we would look at their Agile tool, and we'd find just a lot of dirty data and just sort of inconsistencies where, this epic is split into features, but this other epic has direct user story children and things like that. Or these user stories are assigned to this sprint, but these other user stories are just assigned directly to the release, not put in the sprint, even though this is a Scrum team. So just sort of, lazy or sloppy. I don't want to use the word lazy. These are people working very, very hard, and in some cases, overtime.
But maybe they didn't see the value, right? Like it wasn't something they worried about because they didn't see why it was important.
Exactly right. So there were no reports showing them that this was a problem. There was no one saying that, hey, we really need this information. So that it was just, no idea that this was needed.
This anecdote reminds me of an aspect that we very often don't talk about, because the original planners, so the ones that did the high-level waterfall analysis that came up with the function points and gave it a price and a deadline, those people don't really care about epics and stories because they don't use them, right? They've done their job. They've got the project plan and that's it. The teams don't really worry about how that is documented because they're working in the weeds. They really only care about user stories. So As long as they got their stories, they're fine. And now you have a gap here, which is the high-level planners don't care about epics and stories because they wrote the requirements anyway. And then you have the execution, the team level, which doesn't care about epics and features because they don't use that, right? Like they're not planning at that level, they're planning at the sprint level. And this leaves us a gap, which I think Scrum Masters can help a lot with, because by keeping that discipline of using the same level of granularity to talk about the same things, right? One of the key challenges in prioritization is when you try to prioritize a story with an epic. They're not the same planning currency. You can't prioritize a story over an epic or vice versa because they're not the same thing. It's like prioritizing a trip over, a trip to the US, like, an intercontinental flight for me that I'm in Europe. It's like comparing a trip to the US with the walk to the grocery store and trying to figure out which one to do first. Like they're not the same thing. You're not comparing that. I could compare a trip to the US to a trip to Australia, where you are right now, whereas we are recording, which are 2 places I would love to visit again, right? I can compare those because those are comparable, right? And I think that Scrum Masters can bring that insight and help the teams understand that, look, when we use epics and when we use features, we're actually talking about planning currency, right? So we need to plan at the same level, right? You can't plan stories against epics, you have to plan epics at a very high level, say every quarter, like SAFe does with the PI or something like that. And then you plan the stories at the sprint level, right? Just like you would plan bugs at the daily level or sometimes intraday level and so on. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about planning currency. And it's incredibly useful when it comes to forecasting, which we already talked about, and predictability. It's incredibly useful to use the same planning currency to talk about the same level of details.
Exactly right. And it's interesting because the tools that SSA is using, in this case, version 1, is designed to support scaling methods, in particular, scaled agile framework. But not only that, so they have multi-level Kanban boards built in. They have that concept just built in, so that it's designed to display the epics on a portfolio level board and display, features and capabilities, that kind of thing, on a coordination level board to facilitate, dependency coordination with multiple teams, that kind of stuff. So it's designed with this at least 3-level concept in mind. And that's another thing that the teams really didn't take advantage of, partly because they're so new to Agile and they're just trying to master the Scrum guide. And here they've got this very complex, sophisticated tool with 3 levels of boards. It can be daunting. So that's one reason why I'm quite fond of Klaus Leopold's flight levels, because it feels like that's sort of the minimum, simplest thing that could possibly work to address this problem. He basically says, look, you need boards at the strategy level, you need a way to coordinate things, dependencies between teams, and then you got your team level boards. And just figure out how that works and make sure you set those up. And each one has its own planning, its own WIP levels or other mechanisms for coordinating capacity, matching capacity and demand.
And that's a whole nother conversation, because one of the key aspects of taking into practice something like NoEstimates is that it starts to build the language and the tools you need to start managing demand to capacity. But that's a whole nother episode. We want to dive into that right now. I do have one last question about this for you, Craeg. Looking at the experience you've had so far and looking forward to what's coming next, what do you think is the most useful insight you've gathered from applying NoEstimates in a governmental setting?
The most useful is, it's pretty fundamental, is that there is a way, there is a way to cut the Gordian knot and really understand how to come up with and manage to manage a scope and manage to milestones, to deadlines that can be done. It's not the same as waterfall. It's a very interesting thing because you're almost sort of creating the reality. You don't have a predefined plan. You're developing the plan as you go. So you sort of set the variables that have to be set. You leave the other ones free, which is scope, and managing that. And NoEstimates is the way to do that. So that's just a key enabler, because without that, it would be impossible.
You're back to the detailed planning that we had in good old Gantt chart times.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Great insight, by the way. Thank you for sharing that. Craeg, we're getting close to the end, but before we go, do share with us, where can we find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, of course, Craeg Strong. You can see our company website. Sometimes we have some case studies and things over there, arielpartners.com. And probably LinkedIn is a good place to start.
Absolutely. And for those of you listening in government anywhere in the world, not just the US, do reach out to LinkedIn and to Craeg on LinkedIn and ask him follow-up questions. I'm sure he would be happy to engage and help you out. Craeg, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.